Hello. Oh, yes, here I am. So, welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for coming here. The event is being streamed and will also be in English, which makes my life much, much easier. So, welcome to everyone who is online with us as well. A big thank you to our panel for agreeing to be here and also speak in English. The event is organized as part of a very long process of developing an exhibition on historical and contemporary research on human diversity at the Norwegian Museum of Science and Technology. So we have been researching aspects of this topic for about 4 years with a research project funded by the Research Council of Norway. And we are finally less than 1 year away from opening the exhibition. The exhibition will open in March 2018, so stay tuned. My name is Angeliki Lefkaditou, and I'm a historian of science and senior curator at Teknisk Museum, and one of the project leaders for this exhibition. The other project leader is Jun Hillingstad, sitting down there. We are a big group of people, about 16 working on this exhibition. Some of us are here also, and many more collaborators in Norway and internationally. So the aim with these public events is actually to develop the content of the exhibition or some aspects of the content of the exhibition in collaboration with the audiences that will be coming to the museum. It's an attempt to get out, literally and metaphorically, to get out of the museum's walls and see what people are actually curious about, what they want to contribute to this exhibition. So we want to talk about what we could call our common matters of concern, and it seems like this is a matter of concern for many people tonight. The discussion will start with the help of Stian Supersberger Hamre, who is a biological anthropologist at the University of Bergen. Jan Bill, who is professor in archaeology and the curator of the Viking ship collection at the Museum of Cultural History of the University of Oslo. Jan Zhao, who is an associate professor in social work at the Nord University. And Stina Bang-Svendsen, who is associate professor of pedagogy at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. We will have 4 very short introductions, about 10 minutes each, and then the floor will open for comments and questions. You can, yes, to ask your questions, you can either come here to the microphone or get a paper from Katrina and write down your question if you're a bit shy. And you can also use the hashtag DNA and identity. So before I give the floor to Stian, I will attempt the most challenging task, for me at least, like to recall some of my knowledge of genetics and try to remind us all some of the core concepts that we will be dealing with tonight, so we don't feel completely lost. I thought there would be not so many geneticists here, so I was a bit more comfortable. Now I feel more stressed, but let's try. So the first question is, what is the genome? What is this genome research that people are talking about? So the genome is nothing more than the complete set of an organism's DNA. So DNA molecules, as we may remember from school, are made of 2 twisting paired strands, and each strand is made of 4 nucleotide bases, which always pair as follows: adenine with thymine and guanine with cytosine. So we have this structure like the one that you see over there. So then, now that we kind of remember what the genome is, what is genome sequencing? So that has to do with determining the exact order of the nucleotide bases in the genome. Okay, so what you get is a long list of letters that represent these nucleotide bases. So where do we find this this DNA to do DNA research? We find it in the nucleus of the cells, and it's called nuclear DNA. We use Y chromosome DNA, which is also nuclear DNA, and we use its non-recombining parts in ancestry testing for the paternal line, because only males have Y chromosome. And we also use mitochondrial DNA, which is found in the organelles called mitochondria, and this passes from mother to offspring. So then we follow the maternal line. One of the biggest questions that I had was, okay, then why, or what is ancient DNA? When DNA becomes ancient? So it seems like there is no specific point in time when DNA becomes ancient. But it has to do with DNA that is found within degraded biological tissues. So it can be DNA that is thousands of years old, but it can be DNA that is much, much more recent than that. And what are we looking for when we do this genetic research? We look for DNA markers, which are pieces of DNA that can tell apart things. They can tell apart cells, they can tell apart individuals, populations, or species. So which marker we use depends on the research questions that we have, the expertise that a specific lab has, the cost, time, material that we have, the research traditions or questions that we may have. And here are two commonly used genetic markers. So we may hear people talking about microsatellites or short tandem repeats. That means that there are short sequences of DNA repeated in tandem along a chromosome. And they are mostly outside of genes. And these motifs, as you see there in these three cases, they are patterns of 2 to 5 nucleotide base pairs that occur in thousands of locations within the genome. So scientists document this highly variable number of repeats. They look for these microsatellite markers. And another kind of marker that we use, and you may have heard about it, is the what we call SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And that's even more simple than the previous ones. It's just like substitutions of a nucleotide basis by another at a very certain position on the genome. So researchers document again which variant is at that specific position. So these are two of the genetic markers that are used. So where are we today? What we hear most about is this next generation sequencing, or even more current high throughput technologies. And these technologies are capable of sequencing multiple DNA molecules very fast and with low cost. And this makes them actually quite popular. So as we have written in the Facebook event, all these advances and technologies have produced huge amounts of genetic data which are publicly owned and available to the scientific community, to governments, and also to commercial ancestry companies. And although we know that our DNA is extremely similar, researchers have used statistical methods to investigate the patterns of variation that we can identify using these markers. The interpretation of these patterns is a rather complicated process and requires input from many fields, not just genetics. As one of our informants said, genetics is blind without archaeology or history or anthropology. At the same time, although we can do this, assigning individuals to ancestral lineages is far from a straightforward process. It involves a lot of speculation and often implicates social and cultural preconceptions. So the questions that arise from this kind of research have to do with how then contemporary DNA research relate to our understandings of individual and group identities. What is the relationship between population labels used in genetics and ethnic labels assigned through social and cultural processes? Why are individuals so eager to search their ancestry through DNA typing? And does this have to do something with the hype for genetics and the importance of biology and biological understandings in our society? Or it reflects an even deeper dichotomy between what we would call biology and culture. So to answer some of these questions, we have invited 4 experts in different fields to give us different perspectives on this topic. And first, Stian, who has been working with immigration, mobility, and population composition in medieval Norway by examining aDNA and doing also isotopic analysis. So, Stian, you're first.
Oh, yes. It works? Yes. First of all, thanks for inviting me to speak here, because I'm not a geneticist, as you say, but I've been working with medieval archaeology, with medieval skeletal material, and in the last 4 or 5 years now I've been working with topics around migration, immigration, mobility, population composition in medieval pre-modern Norway. And we did DNA testing of nearly 100 individuals, and we did oxygen isotopes for the same individuals. And what I'm going to present here, when we did when you get the DNA results back, at least, then we divided into haplogroups, mitochondrial haplogroups. That's what I'll be talking about here today, though, because the haplogroups are genetically related individuals with a common ancestor, and this chart shows from the green sub-Saharan Africa, and you see how it's developed from there to 200,000+ years ago until more the last 50,000, and it's spread across the world. And human Homo sapiens sapiens have spread across the world in the last 250,000 years, sort of approximately. And so that's what haplogroups are. And if you look at the composition in medieval, now in pre-modern Norway, if you see medieval Norway in the middle, there you have, I think you have 10 or 11 haplogroups present. And then slightly more, the early modern period, you have pretty much the same. There's 1 or 2 haplogroups are not present there, and there's another one coming too. And if you go further back to the Iron Age, Viking Age, you have quite a varied, heterogeneous population in Norway, and that goes quite a long way back. And I haven't found any data for further back, but I'm sure you're never going to find an homogeneous population in Norway. Well, at least not genetically. If it's culturally, probably not either. But and if you come, this data from Norway, a lot of this is from the city of Trondheim, and if you compare that is on the outskirts of Europe in medieval times. And even if you compare that to other countries I've found some data from, you see the same pattern. You see the haplogroup H is the biggest European haplogroup, and you have the same diversity in most countries. You have a similar pattern all over. It is quite a genetically varied population. And so now we're going to look at 3 case studies. This is a medieval woman. She died in Trondheim in the mid 13th century, and we have reconstructed her face based on her skeletal remains, and she belonged to the haplogroup H4A, and this is where you find this haplogroup today. The center of gravity for this haplogroup is in northern Spain, and also in Central Europe. So my first thought when I saw this that she might come from that region. She might come from Central Europe, northern Spain possibly, and have moved to Trondheim for some reason. But when we looked at her isotopes and figured out where she actually came from, she is born in most likely in the northwestern Russia, completely different area. So her maternal lineage might go down to Central Europe or Spain, but her ethnic or whatever ethnic group, you probably wouldn't find that in Spain. You would find that in Russia and in areas far north. And the next case, you probably know this woman, the Isdals. Has been a lot in the news. What's happened to the haplogroup? It disappeared. But at least I have the map there, where this haplogroup, now H24 she was in the haplogroup H24, and what that told when they found this DNA profile, all they could say that she was most likely probably of European descent, which is. No, it's not very precise to place someone geographically. Once again, isotope analysis have put her birthplace probably in southern Germany, or probably there or grew up in northwestern France. So this time it fitted. She seems to be from Europe. And the personal case, that is my haplogroup, because when you work with this, you have to give a DNA sample yourself, and then I came to know my haplogroup is a J2B1A, which apparently is believed to have branched off from people who have come from the Near East to Europe. So this J2B1A seemed to be a European haplogroup, and has been present in Neolithic cultures in many places across Europe, and today it's mainly found in Western Europe and Russia. And well, it doesn't tell me much really, because I consider myself Western European, and I still do after I see these results. But so, what is this DNA? What is it? Yeah, what is it good for? As you see, it's good for drawing the long lines, the evolutionary lines, of how people are spread throughout the world, and these things. I think it's useful for that kind of work, and of course for forensics, for identifying people, for putting people at the crime scene, and that kind of thing. It's excellent, and also for showing these broad similarities and differences between populations, as I showed in the pie charts in the beginning. But I think some of the topic today is DNA and identity and personal identity. And if you're looking for an identity, I don't think buying a DNA test is the way to go. But in that aspect, it might be more useful as a moneymaker for laboratories than for the people who get the results. And because I had to look at some of these sites preparing for this, and I looked at them, and some of the claims they are making discover your hidden sort of ethnic backgrounds, and you have ancestors from different ethnic groups and from different, and you hear this, some say you're 20% Muslim or 20% Christian or whatever. There's none of this that can be found in the DNA really. As you see, people travel around, people move around, and they bring the DNA with them, and they change, and they move into different groups, and they change ethnic They can change ethnic groups and they can change religion, and yeah. So you won't find this homogeneous population anywhere. So I struggle to see the usefulness of commercial DNA testing in this respect. So that's probably my 10 minutes is gone. I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stian. I will just add that I had this discussion with a professor of genetics at the University of Florida, and she told me that when they have people for DNA typing that is used for medical purposes, some of them ask also to have DNA to know something about their ancestry. And what she said, yes, of course, we give that to them, but we give that for fun, just for them to have something to play with. So I think that resonates quite well with what you said, but it's that some of these games are sometimes a bit dangerous, I think. So our next talk will be from Jan Bill, who has been involved in several projects implicating or employing ancient DNA analysis of human and animal remains. So Jan, it's your turn.
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm very happy to see all of you. I'm not a geneticist either. I'm an archaeologist, as you already know, and I think I might have a slightly more positive view on the use of DNA than what we have just heard. But I would rather start with archaeology. And just asking what is archaeology, because archaeology is the study of the past, but not any past. It's a human past that we are trying to illuminate, and we do that by a wide array of means. We have until recently mainly been looking at artifacts, at structures, and we are now increasingly also looking at biofacts, at remains of animals and human beings. And really, you could say that the biomolecular work is just one way among many different to get closer to an understanding of how human life has been in the past, and ultimately, because that is, so to speak, the ultimate goal of archaeology, is to learn something about the human being per se. What is a human being? How do we function? What is the rules that are guiding our lives, if there are any such rules? So DNA is not a tool for us to that has been invented by us in order to answer that question. DNA studies is something that has been, as most methods in archaeology, been invented somewhere else, and which is now being adapted by archaeologists in order to pursue our goals. And what is it that we can learn from DNA studies of archaeological remains? Well, actually, there is a lot of things that we can learn from it. One thing is that DNA comes with all living organisms, not only human beings. So it can be used for studying animals, plants, and so on and so forth. It can even be used to study the health of human beings who have died. We can look for DNA from bacteria, and when we find that, we can see that that particular person from whom we have retrieved that bacterial DNA have suffered from a specific sickness. We can also look for traces of DNA from animals living in your body and that kind of things. So there are a lot of that kind of issues which comes into play with ADNA studies. But of course, here the main focus is on the human DNA. And in a very simple way, you could say, well, okay, DNA is just another type of typology, just like we have it in so many other branches of archaeology, that we are looking at patterns of that shows that things are related to each other. Just like if we have two Viking swords and they look very close, then we assume that there is some kind of connection between those. There must have been a common idea about a sword, which has resulted in the production of two very similar swords. In the same way, you can say, okay, do you have very similar DNA? Then you can perhaps suggest there is some kind of connection, and that means that we can use ADNA for network analysis, just like we can use a lot of other things. Then, of course, as we have just seen with this example, that network analysis do not work if you only have one thing that you're investigating and look what is related there. You need to have more. Fortunately, with ADNA, there is a lot of information in ADNA, and therefore you can make much more graded, much more specialized network analysis by means of ADNA. But ADNA can also be used to look at questions which are more interesting than this. I think an important thing to remember is that today we are really in the childhood of ADNA studies, that we have by far not seen where this road will lead us, but some of the perspectives could be to investigate cultural traits of human beings. For example, it's very obvious, I think, that by means of ADNA analysis you can study such a phenomenon like control of fertility in society. In societies where there is a high degree of control on who is allowed to mate with who, that will make genetic imprints in the population. That's the kind of things that we can try and trace by means of ADNA studies. If we're going down that line, we could, for example, start to look for strategies for transfer of power, heritage, like patri or matrilinear heritage systems. Does the power go along a male line, along a female line, or perhaps not along any line at all? Is this society that we are looking on one which is more based on meritocracy, where you choose the best person for the job and that kind of things? That is a topic that we can study by means of ADNA once we are able to look at questions like the degrees of relatedness between individuals. I can take an example from a project that we are just about to start up. The Center for Ecological and Evolutionary Synthesis in a consortium with us and with the Inner Mongolian Museum, where we are going to look at graves from a dynastic grave field. And then we're going to try to see if the impression that we got from historical sources and from the archaeology that we here have a dynastic burial place, if that actually contains people who are related to each other, or whether perhaps these people are not related to each other at all, and we therefore have to revise our idea about this culture. That could be one example. I think also that it's interesting to address a question as we had, it was mentioned before, the dichotomy between biology and culture. I mean, we could start to look at how have societies in the past chosen to mate. To what extent have they actually incorporated people coming into the societies with completely different well, not completely different, but should we say different backgrounds, different ethnicity, if you want to, at least people coming, looking different from the society that they're entering to. Will we see their DNA go into that society, or will we see them be excluded? That's also that kind of things that we can look at today. And I think these are very important questions to try to investigate, because these are attempts to try to understand more about who we are as human beings. And maybe we'll find things which we do not find sympathetic, maybe not, but that's not really the matter. The matter is that we learn about how humans have been doing in the past, and that might help us to understand better what humans are today. If there are any ethic considerations to be made concerning ADNA, and there certainly is, then I think the most important one is perhaps really the consumption of ADNA that we are causing today, because we are taking all these samples from a very sparse source material and we're consuming it in our attempt to learn, as I see it, to use ADNA studies. We should be aware that the archaeological material is very, very limited. We have only the smallest, tiniest fraction of all the human beings who have been on the globe in the past. We have remains only of a very, very small, tiny fraction, and we should be careful not to use up that material. ADNA is not equally preserved in all parts of a decayed human body, and the best material that we know today is a few bones in the crania and then the teeth. So it's easy to calculate that we have, with today's technologies, in a well-preserved skeleton, perhaps the possibility to make some 30 ADNA samples. So that's not very much. I mean, we can't just use of this material again and again, and in very many cases we will only have perhaps 1 or 2 chances to take an ADNA sample from an individual, and then the possibility is lost, at least until we have refined the technologies. So a certain patience is perhaps a good thing. We need to develop ADNA sampling techniques, extraction techniques, in order to need much smaller samples in the future. I think also we should be aware about of what we are doing with our archaeological collections. How do we store them? Do we make sure that the DNA which is preserved until today, that still is preserved for the generations coming after us? We should make sure that we keep bones, teeth cold and that kind of things. We should also be more aware of, when we are excavating, that we are actually getting the DNA out. Today, you can actually get out ADNA from the bacteria in the stomach of a person who have deceased hundreds of years ago, if you are actually taking the soil samples and treating them right, and the conditions are favorable. But that means that there's actually a lot of information in burials that we do not get out with the ways that we are excavating today. So we should be more aware of that. So I think ADNA, it has a great prospects. It's a way for us to learn things about human beings that we cannot learn in any other ways. It is something which we need to be aware of, and we can be sure that is something which is going to stay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. Now I feel I need to correct the negative impression for DNA research, because I also think that it's fascinating basic research, and we really need to think very well what kind of questions we can ask and what kind of questions we can answer. As you said, we can very well see if the persons buried in a cemetery were related to each other, but it's much more difficult to actually say by looking at ancient DNA whether these people were Norwegians or whether they were Longobards or whether they were. These are another kind of questions, another set of questions that cannot be answered by ancient DNA research alone. So that's why we need archaeology or history or anthropology and this interdisciplinary cooperation in projects like that. And continuing with more perspectives then, Jan has been studying constructions of Norwegianness through transnational adoptions, and she has been looking at questions on race, biology, kinship, and origin. And she will give us her perspective on DNA and identity.
Thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to participate in the interesting discussion. My commentary is about identity, which everyone has a relationship to that. I want to talk about identity in relation to race and ethnicity and nation. So not that much about DNA. Race, ethnicity, and nation are all about making boundaries. Who belong to us and who belong to the other? How are we different from the other, and how are they different from us? Therefore, these categories are significant in shaping common identities. For example, Norwegians, Chinese Norwegians, Sami Norwegians, or maybe Norwegian Sami, Swedish Sami, all these categories. And also these categories, I mean race, ethnicity, and nation, they are significant in shaping different relations between groups of people, which we call it racial relations, ethnic relations, and international relations. Transnational adoption, that is adoption across national borders, is interesting to study concerning the topic of identity and boundary-making processes, along the concept of race and ethnicity. In addition, adoption touches on important topics like biology, kinship, and place, which are all central to the conception of ethnicity and nation. Transnational adoptees are born in one family and in one country, yet grow up in another family and in another country. So which family and set of kinships the adoptees will identify with? This is a very tricky question. We can also ask how transnational adoptees' national belonging can intersect with the question of biology and kinship. I also want to say that I'm not adoptees, even though sometimes people ask me. And so I studied transnational adoption as an immigrant. Concerning the transnational adoptees' identity, there is one very simple assumption. That is, they are racially different from us Norwegians, yet they are ethnically, culturally the same. However, the reality or the lived experience of these people is much more complicated. First of all, we can ask the question, who are us Norwegians? Or who are the transnational adoptees compared with? We call it native Norwegians. Sometimes we call it native Norwegians. But maybe Sami people would claim that they are more native. Or we can say ethnic Norwegians. But how can we define Norwegian as an ethnic group? Sharing common culture, language, customs. But we all know that there are cultural differences between different parts of Norway. I'm an immigrant. I live in northern part of Norway, and I sometimes see differences. In addition, anthropology tells us culture itself is never enough to define ethnicity or shape ethnicity. In construction of ethnicity and a nation, there has been a metaphor of kinship. So the conception of ethnic Norwegian maybe include the notion of origin and genealogy. That is again expressed through certain phenotypes. That is the physical features that we can identify or we can associate with Norwegianness. So maybe ethnic Norwegians are white Norwegians, which is again about the question of race or maybe DNA. But please do not laugh at me. Many of my friends in China would categorize some of the people from Middle East, for example, Iraq and Iran, as white, because they are literally not dark in skin color, but even more important, they are double-folded in terms of eye shape, which is very important standard, how we Chinese separate us Chinese with the whites. But what my study tells me is that the transnational adoptees, they all demonstrate certain kind of whiteness. Whiteness is not necessarily about skin color. Whiteness can also be something one can do, one can perform, or one can achieve. One girl adopted from India told me about her experience of visiting India. She said, people in India noticed that I was not from there. They saw your postures, your way of dressing and walking. I walk like this, very upright. Do you understand? She asked me because I'm not Norwegian, so she was afraid of I could not understand. He's very upright. So I noticed that the people in India look at me the same way as they look at whites. How people perceive you can also influence how you perceive yourself. There is also a question of self-image and what you say yourself in the mirror. One young man adopted from South Korea told me that before he was 25, his inner image of himself is as a regular Norwegian, white with blonde hair. He said, you can say it is a wrong image, but I had not thought about being a Korean adoptee at all. But how can this happen? You did see yourself in the mirror, right? I asked him, and he explained. But how long would you stand in front of a mirror when you were small? 5-10 seconds in the morning, and then in the evening when you brush your teeth, right? I did not stand there for long thinking about looking different. Transnational adoption not only challenges the conventional conception of whiteness, but also the traditional conception of family, kinship, and genealogy. Biology and DNA is certainly meaningful. Resemblance is one biology-related aspect of adoption experience that my informants talked about. Several informants talk about the wonderful moment when they first saw their biological children. They talk about how they can identify themselves in the children's face. Yet, they also talk about another kind of resemblance, which they can identify with their adoptive parents. For example, temper, gesture, body language, and even voice. Some also refers to their adoptive genealogy to strengthen their belonging to the Norwegianness. For example, another informant said, "I look like a Korean, but I'm not a Korean. I don't know anything about Korean and its culture. Of course, I can read and learn something about it. I could do that, but that is not my culture. For example, I have learned how to make fish balls or fish cakes because this is what my mother and my grandmother do, and they taught me. But I cannot learn how to make kimchi. That is a kind of Korean pickles. Because this is not my culture, right? I'm not brought up to do that." So I also find that there is no unified voice among the transnational adoptees concerning the question of identity and the meaning of biology and DNA. People have different experiences that provide these categories with different content and meanings. I will end my commentary with a citation about an embodied transformation one of my informants experienced when he visited his birth country, Korea. I think this citation is very difficult for me to interpret. I think it may be a good way to engage the audience, so I leave this citation for open interpretation. When I was in Korea, I experienced a transformation that my soul could not manage. I once studied social science myself, so I believe that many things were socially constructed. But this transformation occurred at such a deep psychic plane that I just could not even analyze it myself. It was just a good, warm feeling which came to me without me even thinking about identity. My body changed. It took several days, or maybe 1 week, before I began to realize that something happened. Then I began to notice my body and the feeling of just walking on the street, just to know that I was in Korea, just to look around the people who are of the same height as me. This is something social, but all this, and the smells, I just felt an enormous transformation. Like it was a kind of warmth, I will say. It was like coming out from your breast and then spread all over. And the food, I believe that Korean food is good for me. I don't know what it is about, but I think this is not sociology. That is biology. I believe the food that my ancestors have eaten for generations are good for me in one way or another, compared to potatoes and food in Norway. So I was happier in Korea. I looked at myself in the mirror. Something happened. I had some totally different features on my face. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave when I was to travel home. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I hope you can help us with understanding this quote. But you also made me think of a very interesting phrase that that one of our informants also said, and that was a professor of genetics, Eske Willerslev, at the Geogenetics Center in Copenhagen. So when we visited him to start our collaboration with the center, he said, you know what, genetics killed race and genetics killed ethnicity. We don't care about race and ethnicity in genetics. We only care about populations. But obviously you cannot kill something that you have not created. And it seems like race and ethnicity and similar concepts are important for other people and are important in many different ways. So it's very difficult for genetics or anyone else actually to kill them. So I think that Stina can tell us a little bit more about this. She has been doing research on race, ethnicity, and sexuality in education, and I think it's a good perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. So I come in here from education, and the sad thing is that that means that you can't just sit and listen all the time. I wanted to begin, in light of what everyone has said, to take a minute to think about what you know personally, what you know about your ethnicity, and how your appearance plays into that knowledge. Take a minute. You can discuss it with the person beside you if you like. What do you know about your ethnicity? And how does your appearance play into that knowledge? Okay. I hope I've got you thinking and talking about either the question or something else that was pressing. Regardless, at least you got to engage with what you have been thinking of. I just quickly discussed with you in the break whether you felt you knew a lot about your ethnicity. And do you want to say just a couple of things about whether you know something about it?
Nothing.
You don't know much about it?
No.
No. And why do you think you don't know much about it?
From a small place, we don't have anyone from the outside world or other color or anything, so.
Okay, from your small place in Trøndelag?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like 3,000 people.
Yeah, and you haven't given it much thought because...
There are no one to. We are all the same where I come from, so.
And most people are presumably white.
Yeah, that's the thing. So
Yeah.
I'm in Oslo, I have to be more careful. I find out maybe when I meet other people, how I talk and have the language.
Do you know where your ancestors come from?
No, I have no idea.
No. Right, okay, thanks. I wanted for you to think through this because we use the concepts of ethnicity and race in this discussion, but in the public discourse in Norway, we use the concept of ethnicity primarily, and it means a number of different things, right? It means it refers to the mother tongue that you grew up with. It refers to your family background. It can refer to your genealogy. It might or it might not, but often it does. And it also has a presumed connection to whiteness, which is why one of the reasons why the term ethnic Norwegian has become contested and debated, I think, with very good reason. And I asked you the question, what do you know about your ethnicity and how does your appearance play into that? Precisely because I think that race and ethnicity are sort of twin terms. And that is not only because in my research in education, I see how racial meanings are inflected into how people use the term ethnicity. It's also because the term ethnicity actually replaced race historically when the phenotypical differences that people wanted to describe with the word race was discredited because race does not per se exist. It was a construct, a cultural and scientific construct. People searched for other terms to describe what they meant in everyday discourse as well, and ethnicity came to fill that role. So ethnicity remains inflected with race, even if the term race is not often, particularly not in Norwegian, very often used anymore. I also wanted to ask the question what you know about your ethnicity, to think about genealogy and the role of genealogy and knowledge about family and family background when we think about and construct ethnicities. Because a lot of people will say, for instance, that they're ethnic Norwegian, but if you ask them, do you know what ethnicity your grandparents had? They might know. They might know, oh yeah, well, they were from more or less, this same village or region and so on. No, how about your great-grandparents? And they were like, do you know your grandparents, great-grandparents' ethnicity? Well,
Some are from Rome and some are from Oslo.
yeah, some from Rome, some from Oslo. The thing is, a lot of people, when they say they're ethnic Norwegian, white Norwegians who say that, often haven't checked. So when you talk about ethnic Norwegianness and and when you also look at textbooks like I've done that say that Norway used to be a homogeneous country, that is a trope that is reproduced in education in Norway. There is a concept of homogeneity that is produced concerning most white Norwegians' backgrounds that hasn't really been checked empirically, right? Because a lot of this homogeneity is often presumed. If you check, like in northern Norway, like for me, both my parents' families are from northern Norway. The chances that there are other ethnicities in my family are really high. But I've grown up being used to saying that, but I'm ethnic Norwegian. I've even written it in research papers. But the point was that I was perceived as white Norwegian. That was really the point. So now I don't say that I'm ethnic Norwegian anymore. And I do that for the simple reason that I think that this notion of homogeneity and the very, I would say, the violent myth of Norway as a historically homogeneous country that denies both the existence of other cultural groups than the dominant white one, and also the existence of other peoples in this country, is upheld by people like me who reproduce the idea that, oh, but I'm ethnic Norwegian. And of course, Norway has been a homogeneous society, and then, well, this is sort of a pre-point for the genetic research now. So, one of the sort of grand ideas when the racial sciences were so discredited after World War II was that now we know that race does not exist, and hence we can use science to dispel racism. Yeah? And you know, several of these speakers have touched upon this. And I think also that you can use knowledge about heritage and also genetics to dispel the myth of how the Scandinavian countries have been homogeneous countries. And you've shown how this is something that we can do. We can use this information in this way. That is something that I definitely see the potential in. But then we also have this challenge that even if we now have the chance to, for instance, refrain from reproducing race, the notion of race through family, through, say, artificial insemination, people still choose to reproduce controlling for phenotype or race. People, and this is inbuilt in the industries that provide reproductive technologies today. People opt for that, and they reproduce these categories even if they have the chance, actually, technologically, to refrain from doing that. And that is something that I find interesting at this moment, which makes me a lot less hopeful about the potential of knowledge about genomics, for instance, to dispel the idea that distinct nations, distinct ethnicities, or distinct races can be, so to speak, reproduced through human reproduction. This is a project. This is, I think I maybe said in my sort of little blurb that I was going to talk about how central sexuality is to ethnicity and race, and I'll just end on that note, I think, and we can think more about it. I think that thinking about reproduction specifically and human reproduction is so central to thinking about ethnicity and race, obviously because races and nations are reproduced through sex and reproduction. But also to understand why nationalisms and racism are so concerned with sex and sexuality, and also with gender and women's sexuality in particular. Because control with reproduction is necessary to reproduce the notion of an ethnicity, a nation. It is necessary for the idea that you can create such a construct out of the natural diversity that human life creates. And that is something that I'm very interested in hearing everyone here, and your thoughts also on how the knowledge we now can attain about DNA can play into and interrelate with. So that is the note I'll end on, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stina. I think we are ready to open the floor for discussion and questions and comments from the speakers and from all of us. So if you have a question, just come here to the microphone, or talk to Katrina to write down your question, or hashtag your question. So are there any questions? Hashtag DNA and identity.
If you don't want to go up there and ask them yourself, or else you could just write them down on a paper and I will ask them for you. Any more questions on this? Anyone?
So, any questions? Jan, you want to comment?
Yeah, well, it's not as much a question as perhaps a comment. I think that there is a very interesting connection between what you said and what you said. And I think especially the last citation that you gave was extremely interesting because to me it seems to express an idea that this person, by coming to a place where other people around him or her look the same way, that caused some kind of bodily reaction. And I think that might be an interesting example of some of the things that we need to try to learn more about in order to understand how we work as human beings, because this is something about recognizing yourself in others. It's something about perhaps feeling at home at a non-intellectual level, but at really a bodily level. And if we have that kind of reactions, then we may ask, well, what kind of other things do we have in our bodies or in our genes that actually make us do choices that in the end sums up to creating people, groups of people with different phenotypes, because this is what we see when we look around the world. We do have quite clear ideas about how people look when they come from different parts of the world, and it's not necessary because they are particularly different in terms of genes, but they have apparently, at least some people think so, selected each other for mating because of matching phenotypes. So I think identity and DNA is really an interesting field. And I think in that respect, I mean, the goal of the research is, I mean, I don't think that research has an idealistic goal. I mean, we just want to know more. But I think that that kind of research will help us to understand some of the things that create that kind of feelings that comes up in societies when you're actually not are including and accepting towards people with other phenotypes than yourselves.
Thank you, Jan. Would you like to comment on that?
Thank you for the interpretation. And I have this is a project I in fact did from 2008 to 2012. So some years has passed, but I sometimes think about this citation in relation to myself. I have lived in Norway for 14 years. Of course, I change because I get older, but I sometimes think the question how the environment changed me, because the climate is very different. And I've sought to find out how much, what change is made by the climate and how much change was in fact made by the age. And I was thinking about this citation because I think the environment to make marks in face, right? And maybe the environment, when the environment change, maybe sometimes it can recall a memory from your DNA. I don't know. That's why he said the smells. The smells also make him recognize something, identify something from himself. But thank you for the interpretation.
We have a question there. Would you like to come to the microphone? Just because of the streaming. Yeah. Thank you. You can.
Yes, thank you very much, all of you. I just want to give a comment to the two women. In terms of the citation, could you bring back the citation, or I'll try to remember it. I just want to comment the citation because I think it was really eloquent. And I think that's perhaps where affective and bodily perspectives are really, really nyttig. What's that in English? Useful, thank you. Because the citation says something about sometimes you do have bodily experiences, and sometimes these experiences perhaps don't have any language yet. And that's why sometimes affective perspectives might be very helpful. Yes, thank you. Yes, and also I love the example of the food, because you cannot necessarily explain that with words that fill out the experience in itself, which is really embodied. Thank you. So I just wanted to comment that. And in terms of Stine's inlegg, what's that in English? Presentation, thank you. That's really interesting in what you said, and also that I would like to use your entrance about being a Korean adopted or being an adopted. And I often ask people, am I an ethnic Norwegian? And often there's so different answers to that. Half might say definitely not, due to my appearance, which goes directly into what you asked about. And the other half would say clearly yes, because you have the language, and my adoptees' parents' history is sort of inherited and told, the stories I've heard, the eventyr, all stories is sort of built upon my family's stories, and then it's the adopted family. So sort of your framework works into what you started, Stina. So I think it's really interesting, and I still don't have the answer to that. So just posing a question out to the other ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Would we like to comment, or we have another question? Yeah, Jun.
Yes, I have a question. I think it's mostly to Jan Bill. You were talking a lot about all these possibilities, all the questions you can address with the help of ancient DNA, which are all, I agree, it's a very interesting questions, and there's a lot of possibilities in this type of research. However, if you look at the type of ADNA research that is being done today, I think the overwhelming majority of it is about populations, and these populations are usually ethnically or linguistically or nationally delineated, and it's about relationships between population, movements of populations, and somehow it's often related to this issue of ancestry or ethnicity of present populations. And my question is, why have I mean, if you go back to the interwar years, archaeologists was also very interested in these issues. That was, for many years, it was not so high on the agenda. Now it's it's been coming back the last decades, and this probably has got to do with the technological possibilities, of course, because of the DNA. But I suppose it's more than that. And so I would like to, I mean, could you say something more about, one thing is, why have these topics got so much interest the last years, and you know, where does these research questions come from? Is it the funding bodies who all want this kind of research? Is it society? Is it? It's not only that it's a lot of this type of research being done, but it's also very publicized. It's a lot of public fuss around it. And then one more other question, is there also this wave, is it coming to an end? You are talking about all these other type of questions that you can address with the ADNA. Is this the new trend, or is it what interests you as personally? Or I mean, yeah, could you say something about this?
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to try to answer the questions. I think that on this question about where does the question comes from, I think a very important driver here is actually the technology. It becomes possible to analyze first mitochondrial DNA and then kernel DNA, map it, and start to ask questions. And then the questions are limited by the technology which is available, because you can't ask any type of question if you only are able to decipher a very, very small fragment of the DNA. So you need to ask very simple questions. And then as the technology becomes better and you can analyze larger and larger parts of the DNA, then you can start to ask more and more complicated questions. And at some point we'll presumably be able to reconstruct entire genomes and also be able to pay for it, which is a main hindrance, or has been so far. And then of course we can ask new sets of questions which are more accurate. So I think a lot of the questions comes from the possibilities that the technology opens up for. When it then comes to the what relevance that kind of questions has to archaeology and to society in general, I think that's exactly the reason why we as archaeologists actually are going into these corporations, because we think that we can help to formulate better questions and to analyze the data in better ways so that we get more useful information, and also by pointing out the direction for new questions, so that rather than being technology driven in some direction which is coincidental, then actually we can say, well, but this is a type of question we would want to have an answer to, so can't you develop in that direction so that we can get answers for that, and in that way start to take the lead in where this research is taking us. When it comes down to the questions that have been asked so far, I think that the description that you gave was a little bit harsh. I think that that what we are basically trying to look for today in for example the Viking genomic project from Copenhagen, that is, if we can actually start to ask questions about what happened to the Viking population that settled in Britain, were they dissolved in the population there, or did they keep for themselves, or what happened? What happened to the Scandinavians that went into to the east? Did they survive as group? Were they becoming part of the Slavic population, and so on and so forth? And I think that is questions which are cultural in nature, because what we see on the archaeological side is that these groups, they do disappear. They put some marks on the local culture, and then after a while we do not see them as something separate anymore. They kind of disappears, and then it's interesting for us to know what happened, because that's something that helps us to understand the way that the cultural history of these different areas has been, and also the other way around. Did we have the Viking Age was a period where people from Scandinavia traveled a lot. There was slavery going on, and so on and so forth. Do we see that supposed increased mobility also in the genetic record? Do we have a greater influx of people into the Scandinavian countries from the outside? And I think that that kind of questions I mean, I'm not sure that we're going to get answers to that, but that's the kind of questions that is being posed. And the difficulty is, of course, what Stian has shown us today, that basically, or not basically, but let's say on a very superficial level, the population in Europe is quite similar all over because it's very heterogeneous all over. So it's really not very easy to start to see admixture processes and that kind of things, as long as we're just working on the more primitive levels of ADNA studies. But once we go deeper down, then we start to get that kind of possibilities. I don't know if that was answers to all your questions, but some of them at least.
Thanks. Stina, you wanted to say something, and Stian, did you want to comment?
Yeah. So we're going sort of back and forth. I have a comment to Lynn Preitz's question, and I think that what I think that some of the things that Yen Tel's presentation shows so eloquently is how phenotype is attributed meanings in our society, and how our language so poorly describes that experience of racialization, which is what I understand it to be. And I think that the way we use the term ethnicity is you could say a linguistic technology for hiding and denying the significance that is attributed to phenotype. I think that was kind of I was in a roundabout way sort of pointing to that issue in my talk. And I think that this, we are a lot of scholars in the Nordic countries these days who are bringing up the significance of race and the continued significance of race as an effect of continued racism in our society. So the idea is that not that race exists genetically, but that an idea of race and racial stereotypes are being reproduced through racism in our societies, and that we need to be able to address that fact of racial discrimination more effectively, and hence be able to talk about discrimination and stigma based on phenotype. Now, that is something that is ongoing in the research community, in the activist communities, among people who are concerned with racism. But at the same time, you have this revival also of research that is interested in investigating possible racial meanings also through genetics that are not necessarily using the old racial categories, but using categories similar to them, like in racially informed medicine research and some other fields. So you see, as Jon pointed to, there are a series of questions being asked to genetics that suggest that people are also trying to address the continued significance of racism in society, and asking questions about what we used to understand it as race through that. So I'm just pointing out that these two fields, that race is being researched from these very different angles at the same time. So what I want us to think about is the possible connections this might have, and to ask all of us, like, what is going on right now about our social knowledge and ideas around the concept of race. If that was meaningful to you, I hope so.
Stian, would you like to?
Yes, I'm going to go back to Jan. Yeah, 'cause one of the interesting things for the future now is pathogens, and like I think DNA has can contribute a great deal to the spread of different diseases and where you find them. And we are working on a couple of projects at the moment with different diseases as well. But the problem, you are slightly more optimistic than me with regard to some of these issues, but particularly bridging the gap between the technical DNA data and culture and these kind of things. How can you get from data? How is it do you think it will be possible to interpret cultural affinities from the genetic data at some point? Because I struggle to see how that is done.
Well, no, I don't think you can do that. What you can do when you're looking at DNA, when you're studying DNA, is that you can study DNA. And but what you can see is what human beings have been doing through the DNA. And what we can see is the mating issue, who gets children with who, and that can help us a lot to understand a lot of social checks and balances in different societies, which actually produce then some kind of result. And I think that's the core understanding here, that with DNA you can only investigate DNA, but you can use DNA studies to illuminate social questions. So that's one thing. And I think that's also plays into what you're saying. Yes, you can say that it is a way of studying race. I wouldn't use that word because it's not it's not a word that actually explains anything. But I think that we can study how phenotypes are perhaps or perhaps not influencing mating patterns. So that could be one thing. We can study in the combination, how we comes into the cultural history part. I gave the example of how we are going to try to see if we actually can find family patterns in a burial site where the burial rituals and the datings and what we know about that culture from historical sources and so on, suppose that here we will have a burial site with different generations of the same family, and then we can go in and try and look, is that actually what is there, or is that something different? And that way we can start perhaps to correct our ideas based on other sources. So that's a way to make that kind of connection. I think also it's interesting to take the example of Scandinavian immigrants to England in the Viking Age and combine the genetic results with place name maps and see, is there more does there seem to be more Scandinavians in area where we have a lot of Scandinavian place names, or is that the same all over? And so that will also tell us things about these interactions. But of course we cannot say anything about an individual individual's identity on the basis of ADNA.
No, could you trace Scandinavian genetic influence on the British population, or how?
Well, I don't know.
Are these populations different to begin with, to such an extent that you can see one or the other influencing?
Well, I think if we are looking at mitochondrial DNA, if we are looking at Y chromosome, at that level which we have been working up to now, no, that would not be possible. I don't know if it's going to be possible now when we are actually getting much deeper sequencing and much more data. to work with. We are moving forward into new land here where nobody have been before, so we just have to see.
No, it can be interesting if you find that it actually works. You can provide the interesting result. I guess we'll know in the next 10 years or so, at least a bit more.
Well, this project should be finished in a year, so we'll have one answer there and then a new one in 2 years and 3 years.
But not to make this too esoteric, I think we should take the next question from the audience.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, I want to say thank you to the organizer and the experts to give us a so interesting discussion. And I wish to share my story of how I know the past of my family. When I was a child, my father told me, "Oh, your father and your ancestor is so glorious. You win a lot of war. You survive from starvation, and survive from a lot of natural disaster." Until one day, I read the story of my family name. It's a name of old kingdom in China, but it was conquered, disappeared in history. So the people use the name of the kingdom as their family name. So I know maybe the story is 100% the truth. So the Asian DNA, I think it opened a window for us to know our past, the family past, the earlier generations. How it interact with other nations, how it survive from natural disaster, how it interact with infectious disease and other environmental factors. But my mother gave me another story. My mother said, my mother is the minority in China. It's in Man nation, which related to the last dynasty. Yeah, since they live in capital in Beijing, so maybe it related with royal family. That's my mother's story. So this time I really hesitate. I really doubt if it's truth. That's my comments, and I have a technical question. If we analyze the mitochondrial DNA, as you know, mitochondrial DNA is inherited from the female. Its mother gave this DNA to the daughter, and so use me as an example. Maybe the mitochondrial DNA analyze results could be different from the core DNA results, because my mother and my father, they have two different independent bloodline. So do you think the core DNA is more advanced than the mitochondrial DNA techniques? Thank you.
No. I was going to ask who is going to answer.
Yeah. Okay. Well, which technique is more advanced, I really can't say, but the amount of information in the kernel DNA is much, much larger than in the mitochondrial DNA, and for that reason there's much more information to extract from that, and also the mitochondrial DNA is only related to the energy production in the body, so it has a very limited role, and the kernel DNA is the DNA which shapes how you look and so on and so forth. the information the most information would be found in the kernel DNA, and your kernel DNA would be equally composed of kernel DNA from your mother and from your father's side. So you have both of them with you there. But right, yeah, it's only your mother which have contributed with the mitochondrial DNA.
So we have a few more questions. But I would like to ask something, if that's possible. So I have been thinking about two things mainly. One thing is that when you're talking about the Vikings, for example, we know that this was this is a very specific label that we use to describe a group of people who were mainly raiding, who were doing something. But then talking with a lot of scientists and geneticists mainly, a lot of times they will use the phrase Norwegian Vikings or Swedish Vikings. And then things become complicated because to my understanding, the correct phrasing would be Viking, a Viking person, a Viking individual coming from the geographic area that now is described as Sweden, or that now is described as Norway, for example. But creating these shortcuts and calling this person Norwegian or Danish or Swedish, this is where things become very confusing also for the public. Because these like short titles, they don't necessarily remain within the lab. When we put the labels on a sample, sometimes they slip out of the lab, and they also influence the way we start talking with each other and the way we communicate that to the public. So then there is a cobbling, as you say, there's a connection there that becomes more contested. So my question is, in your projects, both your projects, how easy it is to avoid such connections, and especially when you're working across disciplines, how do you separate?
Well, we probably separate less than we should. The problem is, of course, even more complicated because Danes is a very old term. It actually goes back to before the Viking Age. There were Danes before that. They were not necessarily living all over the area, which is Denmark today, and so on. And Norwegians, Norway is also an old name, and so on and so forth. So it's from some perspective, you could claim that, well, you can speak about Norwegians in the Viking Age and Danes in the Viking Age. But you couldn't speak about the Norwegian kingdom, or not necessarily about the Danish kingdom, and that is, of course, what people understand. If you say a Dane today, then it's somebody coming from the state Denmark, and the state Denmark did not exist. So the bottom line is that that it's, for all practical purposes, really, really hard to avoid that slip of tongue, so that suddenly it stands Viking in the in the title of your paper in some journal or something like that. Also because basically it's people who are sitting in those editorial boards, they also are fascinated by Vikings, so they also want to have that word in order to increase the interest in the journal and so on and so forth. Absolutely, as in any other part of research, we are not in a value-free area. So words and language are being shaped in order to promote your agendas and so on. But I think that what we can do about this is that we can take the opportunity whenever it arrives to explain what we mean by these words, to put out the limitations and so on, and try to educate the population. And perhaps it's the most important actually when we are doing that part of our work, which is communicating to the broad public, that we are actually saying what the problem is and how the things comes out as they are. So I actually owe you a thank for putting forward this problem here in this presentation today.
Stian, you wanted to respond as well, or should we move forward? Okay, Katrina, you have the questions?
I have 3 questions from the audience here. And I think I just ask all 3 of them, so you can answer if you want to. Can popularity today and great interest in DNA of today simply express curiosity and craving for own stories, spurred by new tech? And the other question is, this is from closer, okay. Don't you think the increasing interest in genealogy, like who do you think you are, is related to searching for some kind of deep identity? Asks Heidi. And I have another question that is for a neuroscientist, who I don't think we have here today, but I will still ask the question: what does today's neuroscience say about DNA? What kind of influence does it have on our consciousness, and how much does it determine consciousness? Quite a difficult question. Can you answer that?
Thank you, Katrina. I think the 2 first questions are actually quite related, and I have one that is also very related to that, and I think that we can all try to respond to this. Because I like the 2 first persons who asked, I was thinking about the difference between what has been called as recreational DNA testing or DNA typing that has to do with someone's curiosity. Like saying, oh, I'm so boring. I've heard it. I'm so boring. I only know that I'm Norwegian. So maybe I should take this test and find out that I have something very exotic in me. And that is kind of, that's what I would call a game somehow. It's an interesting game if you have the money to spend, and if you're willing to extend your imagination a little bit. Maybe it's nice. Maybe it's interesting. But there are also high risks in this kind of research. For example, indigenous people have been turning to these kinds of technologies to confirm or to support their claims. Would the Sami person be identified as Sami through their? Well, that was a small accident. Yeah. But would a Sami person would be identified through their DNA, and what kind of dangers would that or dangers or risks could that entail? Does someone or a person or a group of people actually realizes what it means to change or try to shift your identity based on your genetic data or your biology? So yes. Stian, we can go like this.
No. With the Sami population, if you can, they go again. Being a Sami, I don't think that's a genetic thing. Even though you have certain genetic markers that are claimed so far to only be found in the Sami population, but the Sami is also genetically a varied group. It's not. So I think it's difficult to claim that right based just on your DNA. And with the other question, people searching for an identity in the DNA. The lines you see in your DNA, they go far back. They are not. I think your identity is created more now than 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or whatever. And something you often hear where people have done these tests, and then they say one is I'm 2% Neanderthal, and some other guy says he's 4% Neanderthal because this comes up on these sheets, but that doesn't make you a Neanderthal for that reason. It doesn't really change you in any way. There's something weird about this concept of this commercial DNA finding your identity through these tests. I don't know.
Well, I think that what we're seeing is people playing around with a new type of information which has not been available before, and that makes some fun, and sometimes you might break your dreams by doing that. But alas, maybe that's not so bad. When things do not come out as you thought, when you suddenly discover that things are completely different than you believed them to be. I don't think it's something that we should try to have some kind of moral opinion about. Because if you're not hurting other people with it, I don't really see that it's anybody's responsibility to keep you away from it. I think that would be okay.
Yeah, I'm not an expert about DNA, but I want to answer that question: how much genealogy can mean to us in relation to the identity? We heard the story of that man. Unfortunately, he just left. I also have a family name that belonged to a royal family once in Song Dynasty. Once I was very proud of it. And then one day I found out if we trace back to our ancestries, we have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and 8 great-grandparents. So if we go back to 10, 15 generations, we have a lot of ancestors. I'm sure one of them belonged to the royal family. So I was not that excited about that anymore. Because I'm okay, who am I today have been influenced by so many. So the genealogy can, in fact, mean different things to different people. Like you said, one feel, oh, I'm just Norwegian, or I'm just Chinese, so boring, I want to find out more. And also I want to say something about the comment, the first comment we get from the audience, that how much ethnic Norwegian I am being adoptee. I think this is about a different positioning process, depending on who asks you and how the positioning process is ongoing. For example, compared with me, who did not grow up in Norway, I think there are more ethnic Norwegian than me. So it's about how persons are positioned to each other in asking and answering that question. And I also want to say that the conception of race, even though we can say that race is not something exists, but the conception exists. And a lot of our daily experience is in fact affected by the conception of race, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. Just think about the question, where are you? Where are you really from? Where are you actually from? I once asked this question to one of my colleagues from England who is visiting Buddha, and some people think it's very strange, the question coming from me, who is an outsider. So, yeah, that is my comment.
Yeah, who do we think we are? And can asking that question through genealogy be an expression of curiosity and a search for a deep identity? And I think yes, definitely both. And I also think that it's significant. I think it's significant what stories we tell about ourselves, and I think it's very significant what stories we tell about our families. And I find it significant partly because of the connection between the concept of family and the concept of nation. Because we think of nationhood as some sort of extended family. So when we find out things about our family, we implicitly find out something about, and this is, I'm thinking now about this ethnic Norwegian group again. If people who identify with a nation, that is a precaution here. If people who identify with a nation find out something about a family that changes their perception of themselves, they're also changing their perception of their nation. So potentially we can learn something about diversity by interrogating into our genealogy. And I think that is a potential that should be explored, especially as the knowledge of the colonization of Sápmi and the oppression of other national minority groups in Norway is becoming more available to people. I think that research into genealogy can also be a sort of a source for diversifying narratives about the people who used to call themselves ethnic Norwegian. I find that is something that is perhaps too hopeful, but it is one sort of potential. But then again, there is what I started out with saying as well, that there is. We seek answers in our genealogy and in our biology and our bodies for all kinds of questions that it fails to answer. And it will still fail to answer so many of those questions that we keep asking. And I do think that we should also look to other sciences and other social processes for answers to a lot of those questions, and that could be very fruitful as well.
We have more questions. Katarina? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, hello. The last decade or so, there has been a lot of research in the field of epigenetics, which I know has to be an incredible tool, especially for archaeology and anthropology. Could you tell us a bit more about what kind of research there has been done, or if there are any physical barriers that are set, like degradation of DNA or such things?
Well, I can't answer very much because I know little about it myself, but it is one of the themes which are being discussed. I haven't personally seen any papers on anybody doing it yet on aDNA, but certainly it can be interesting in many ways. One question could, for example, be, epigenetics, that's about opening up genetic resources which are not usually being read and employed when the body is being built, but which are inherent in the genes and which can be exposed when they fold out. And that could, for example, mean that you have well, there have been experiments in mice where you can see that a gene for aggressiveness can be unfolded by environmental stress to the animal, and then it's given passed on to the children of that animal, so they become more aggressive than they were, their parents were from the starting point, in spite of that's not a new gene which have come into it. Right? So you have like the reading, the effect of the gene is being changed in that way. And you could imagine that, and it's often seen as a first step towards evolution, that you kind of activate something which becomes an advantage in surviving, and that again can help that particular feature to become more dominant in the population than all the individuals who do not have it. So it could be interesting to see if, for example, groups of people living in circumpolar areas, they have some epigenetic characteristics which are different from what you see in other parts, that you could have that kind of changes being shown there. I don't know about how far you can actually go down that road today with today's technology, but it seems that the potential is there. But it was just for me, so far into the future that I didn't want to mention it before when I was giving my introduction.
I think we have time for one more question and a quick comment maybe from the panel. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm a little bit late, but I think you will find this interesting. I'm working a lot with traditional music, and my family has done so for generations. So my father was very good on telling me of his forefathers in his area of Norway. So I just grew up with a kind of, not national identity, but valley identity. And a lot of Norwegians have that identity. So you have the national identity and you have the local identity. And my valley, my father's valley, to say that, he was the first one to marry out of it. So when you say that you have 16 great-great-grandfathers and 32 behind that, then I have researched and found that a lot of people turn up many places in that particular list many times. So because I married inside the valley again, my sons do have the same ancestor 13 times. Over 500 years. And when I asked my father if that ancestor, how many descendants does that man have? And he just started to laugh. Because actually, as I could see it, it would be the entire valley. We were all related. So, or at least over 500 years, we relate to 5 different persons who actually have descendants all over that area. So, you see, it gets very tangled in some parts of our country. And that creates a lot of identity and a lot of stories and a lot of tensions, I can tell you that. So, so I can say that because we marry always, they had married inside their areas. You have to be, they're sorting out some very distinct ethnic traits inside those areas because everybody is related, everybody are related. And that's also has to do with the kind of cultural thing, the folk music in the area and all those things. I just have to throw that one into you because it's just the last 2 generations that people actually started to marry out of it. Did you see? So.
Thank you. So I think we should have one last comment from the panel. And since I have the microphone, I can start. I was thinking what Jan Bill said about moral responsibilities. And I think that outside any moralistic discourses, all of us as scientists or social scientists or humanities scholars, we have some kind of responsibility of discussing openly what our assumptions are, what are the possibilities and the limitations of the kind of research that we are doing. And when it comes to these kind of questions, which are so close to how people perceive themselves and how people perceive others, maybe these responsibilities become even higher to kind of be explicit about what you're doing and why you're doing that and why you have funding for that. why do you request for millions of euros or dollars to do this specific kind of research? And I think we have to demand from the commercial ancestry companies to be more explicit about the kind of information they are offering to the public. So then everyone can be, if they wish to be informed, in what kind of game they are playing and how much they can get out of it and how much they can trust about that.
With regard to your last points, I'm not sure if it will sell really well if they would tell exactly what you 100% could say. But what I'm hoping for, I'm hoping there will come something good out of Jan's research. Jan we will get deeper into this because that could be interesting. But I think, as with any other science, it can't work on its own. It can't answer the questions by themselves. So I think the only way forward is to make the research project as multidisciplinary as possible and include information from, just about any thinkable source.
Yeah, I think it's been a very good discussion tonight. I completely agree with you that we should have some demands on the companies, actually, because obviously DNA information is something which is very sensitive for living persons, and you don't want to have your DNA floating around for your insurance company to see, for example. So obviously there are issues there which we need to be aware of. I completely agree with you that DNA studies first really comes into their full use in archaeology when you combine them with a lot of other studies and you look at it contextually. That's the way we're going. That's the road we're going on. I also think that we do have very good reasons to think about and talk about and discuss how the research that we are doing can be understood, used, and possibly misused in terms of building ideologies and that kind of things. If we do not do that, we would be kind of blind scientists. We should not be that. But I think that is not a reason, and nobody here has said it was, but it's not a reason to not doing the research. It's just that we have to be aware of the potentials that are in it, the good ones and the bad ones.
I also think this is a very good discussion and different perspectives. And I think people from different disciplines do need to talk to each other. And I also want to say that the scientific knowledge and the scientific findings always are situated in certain context. As you said, when we get the results from the DNA test, we should be more aware of what kind of information we are getting. So I think I think your project is important because it brings the science closer to us and makes us to reflect upon the science from different angles. What we receive is not absolutely truth.
I would like to start with saying and when engaging with human DNA and asking questions to the genes about our ancestry and history, we should be very mindful of how people have asked these questions before and the knowledges that they have gained or thought they have gained from asking questions about society to human bodies before. Of course, race science was at the very forefront of Western science, and everyone agreed that this, had to be very solid science. And people did not have in the community that in Norway, in let's say the beginning of the 20th century, people will gather at meetings like this and discuss race science as the thing that was, you know, the science of the future that could help us actually find out something new about society, you know, and inform policy and so on. And I think it's so important to be mindful of that history and how people and how we are also caught in the common sense and also the sciences, and scientists are also producing their questions within the common sense of our historical period and our social situation. And I think that having a sort of historical awareness of how have these questions been asked before and in what context and what sort of knowledges has that produced is also an ethical responsibility that scientists across disciplines need to deal with.
Thank you so much. That was a good, a very good comment also for us as we are building this exhibition that combines insights from historical science and contemporary science. So I think we have come to an end. Thank you very much for staying with us for almost 2 hours. Thank you very much to the panel and to Kulturhuset for hosting us here. So I hope, we all hope that we will see you again somewhere in Oslo or at Teknisk Museum or online on our Facebook page. Thank you so much. Good night.